carry on with these, at least in part, even after we're able to resume in-person talks and visits to our alumni in the UK and around the world. It's a particular pleasure this evening to welcome one of our alumni and an honorary fellow of the college, General Sir Richard Shirreff, who read modern history here in the 1970s. Richard has had an extremely distinguished career. He served in the British Army in the Gulf War of 1991, in Iraq, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, and Bosnia. He served at Army headquarters and in the Ministry of Defense. And he was also NATO's Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which is the highest post to which a European military person can rise in the NATO structure. And since retiring a few years ago, he's co-founded and become the managing partner of Strategia worldwide, adopting a strategic approach to retirement life, just as he adopted a strategic approach to his military career before he retired. Richard, in a sense, is one of those speakers who needs almost no introduction, but I'm going to stop in a moment, but I'll just give you one anecdote, which is that a few years ago, Richard kindly consented to be the speaker, one of our evening speakers at our Exeter College summer program. And the lure of his talk produced a phenomenon which I've never seen before or since, and that is of students running to hear the lecture. Well, we can't run this evening, but we can do so virtually. I'm looking forward, I'm sure you all are, to hearing Richard talk on the subject, Battlefield to Boardroom, what might business leaders learn from the military approach to managing risk? And just before I hand over to Richard, I'll mention that it'd be useful if you would mute yourselves if you haven't already. We're recording this talk. It will be available later as a podcast. When Richard has finished his presentation in 20 minutes or so, we'll then have a Q&A session, and you'll be able to use the hands function on Teams, which, as many of you know, is in the toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. But that's for later. For now, Richard, over to you.
Well, Rector, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, fellow Exeter alumni, good evening to you all. I'm honored to be with you. Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you very much for the invitation to join you. And I think I probably am, like many or most, if not all, alumni, feel a huge debt to Exeter College, a massive debt to my tutors, Paul Slack and John Maddicat. There's no question, I think, that looking back 45 years or so, or nearly 45 years, that the confidence that, and somehow the atmosphere of Exeter and the people I met, many of whom remain very close friends, gave one a confidence that has been instrumental in whatever has followed since. I particularly regret, though, not being in Oxford during Trinity term, but hey, maybe we can return to that previous state, if not soon at some stage. As Rick Traynor said, when I left the military world 6 years ago, in a sense, I released my inner entrepreneur and set up a business, Strategia Worldwide. It's a risk management consultancy. I set it up with my business partner. But my understanding of risk is based on that 37 years or so as a soldier, during which I commanded on operations or in combat at levels from every level, actually, from junior command of a platoon of around 30 men to a division of around 25,000 men and women. Operations I was involved in ranged from Northern Ireland, combat as a tank squadron leader in the first Gulf War, Bosnia as the operational commander when I was Deputy Sakar, Kosovo as a brigade commander, and then Iraq again, 2006 and 2007 as a divisional commander, and in my last job as NATO's Deputy Strategic Commander, Afghanistan as a member of the Strategic Command Group, which oversaw the NATO operation. And the one unifying factor in that experience is that managing risk underpinned everything we did. Hence my subject today, whether there's anything that business leaders might learn from the military approach to managing risk, particularly in the context of a crisis caused by a global pandemic, which has forced all organizations, whatever their sector, to think deeply about effective risk management, crisis management, and how best to build resilience in order to survive and emerge successfully from crisis. And I think that the old ways, if anything, this pandemic has demonstrated, it is that the old ways of looking at risk in silos have proved inadequate. And that the world, I won't say post-COVID, because we'll never be in a post-COVID world, but the world since the start of the pandemic and the future as it stretches out requires a different approach. Hence, I think the relevance of some aspects of the military approach to managing risk to businesses. And let me say at the outset, and be quite clear, that the military has by no means got it right, as any study of military history, particularly that great book by Dr. Norman Dixon, The Psychology of Military Incompetence, will attest to. However, failure can be a great teacher. Now, the campaigns we have been involved in during the first 2 decades of this century, the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then to say nothing of other recent and current conflicts in Libya and Syria, reflect the reality of 21st century conflict, congested, contested, and confused with multiple stakeholders, subject to the demands and pressures of globalization and 24-hour media coverage. But this complexity is not confined to the military world. Business too faces similar challenges. And even if no one's shooting at you, the experience and methodology applied by the military in managing risk is relevant, whatever your sector. In the world we live in, complex, volatile, and uncertain doesn't mean third world. Increasingly, it means everywhere. And the all-pervasive nature of the media and the instant voice it gives everyone on Twitter and the like means that military commanders and chief executive officers alike have to take into account the views, needs, and power of local communities, regional and national governments, international organizations, aid agencies, humanitarian organizations, and non-governmental organizations, all of which places a premium on winning and maintaining hearts and minds. So operations need to be subjected to the criterion, what impact will what we want to do have on the minds of the people among whom we are operating? And I say that in the widest sense of the word. Because if you alienate the people you're operating amongst and on whose consent you depend, you gift the advantage to your adversary or your competitor. And this means people-centric, or perhaps in more familiar jargon, stakeholder-centric planning and strategy design. Ultimately, success depends on the closest possible integration with other actors on the stage. This means avoiding any fortress or silo mentality, opening up doors, acting transparently, and building the relationships, structures, culture, and language to develop the necessary unity of purpose, or at least unity of understanding. And the key principle which underpins so much is that whatever we do alone is not as important as what we can do together. For the military, how it engages with its friends is as much a concern as how it deals with its adversaries. It's about bridge building, the essence of what the military calls the comprehensive approach. And the business world faces similar challenges. Take the energy sector, and I include the fast-growing renewable sector. Companies here must also take account of the multitude of stakeholders who have an interest in what they do, because the impact of globalization and 24-hour media, particularly social media, now gives an increasingly influential voice to stakeholders potentially opposed to their interests. And any sector must recognize that it will be operating among the people, because there will always be those with a concern, with an axe to grind, sometimes entirely justifiably, I should say, And those stakeholders have a voice which, if ignored or denied, can threaten company reputation and jeopardize commercial success. Hence, in particular, the importance of managing environmental, social, and governance, or in the current jargon, ESG risk effectively. The Financial Times lexicon defines ESG as a term used in capital markets and by investors to evaluate corporate behavior and to determine the future financial performance of companies. ESG factors are a subset of non-financial performance indicators, including, among other things, sustainable, ethical, and corporate governance issues. For example, recent mining catastrophes, particularly the two tailings dams disasters in Brazil in 2015 and 2019, the latter of which caused massive loss of life, as well as environmental damage, highlight the critical importance of getting ESG right if companies are to attract investment. And even that most hard-nosed of global investment fund managers, BlackRock, have now got in on the act, with Chief Executive Officer Larry Fink writing to the CEOs of companies in which BlackRock invests, excuse me, stressing the importance of adhering to ESG standards if investment is to continue. Also relevant is the point made by the head of sustainable finance at RBC Capital, when he said, "You will see a lowering of the cost of capital for those companies that can proactively address the issues that ESG investors want them to look at." So while a failure to address ESG properly is a risk management issue, the converse is true. And for enlightened companies, it is also a substantial value add. The approach to ESG will reflect the culture of a company. If an organization works in a number of silos, which many companies do, effective management of ESG risks will be compromised. The ability to assess organizational effectiveness is one important factor in assessing the level of exposure, and boards need to understand this as an element of risk exposure. As such, it is also a measure of the CEO and the leadership. And here the approach to understanding risk that we've brought in from our military background is relevant, particularly where ESG risk and its linkage with other risks, for example, security or geopolitics, needs to be effectively managed. A similar integrated multidisciplinary approach to that found on the battlefield will also ensure that boards properly understand the environment in which they're operating and are equipped with the mechanisms to ensure that risk or whatever threatens a company's source of strength is appropriately mitigated. Well, how to meet this challenge? First, there's the need for a deep and comprehensive understanding of the environment, because without understanding the economic, the social, the security, the technical, the ethical, the media, the political, the legal, environmental, and regulatory, and a host of other forces at work, you cannot derive the right tools, structures, and proficiencies required. Second, the importance of strategic leadership is as applicable in the boardroom as it is on the battlefield, because simple rules or principles of leadership and templates of decision-making do not necessarily serve one well in complex situations where there are no right answers, just limited choices between the least wrong ones. So clarity of thought, vision and adaptability exemplify the strategic leader as much as resolution and determination, an ability to live with ambiguity and uncertainty, and not least a pragmatic capacity to take calculated risk for the longer term and greater benefit, distinguish the successful strategic leader from the tactical operator or manager. Fundamentally, it is about being successful on two counts: strategy, how to win a war, and tactics, how to win a battle. In the words of the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, written around 550 BC, are just as relevant to business as they are in the military. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Next, successful execution of strategy depends on what the military called mission command, effectively empowerment, empowering subordinates, supporting and resourcing them, but also recognizing that they have to be accountable at the same time. In the military world, success is dependent on trusting the people on the ground to use their initiative. They can see what's happening. They can understand the risks, the challenges, and the opportunities infinitely better than anyone sitting back in a remote headquarters or head office. But they must use their initiative in line with the overall strategy. They must be crystal clear about the intent and what is to be achieved. Senior leadership must ensure not only that the strategic intent is clear and well understood, but that the front line has the resources and the functional support, including strategic level assets, needed to achieve the mission, and then let them get on with it. But this needs trust, and trust takes time to build. And in a world where international travel is increasingly constrained, empowerment of local deliverers will become even more important, and therefore trust even more so. Mission command or empowerment does not mean delegation of authority or responsibility. In the military world, command is indivisible, and the commander remains responsible for everything, including risk. Risk management is factored into every aspect of the decision-making process. Every commander is his or her own risk manager. And fundamental to this management of risk is effective strategy design and implementation. And strategy design is, I suggest, best served by thinking right to left, starting with an analysis of the situation. Where are we now? What are the risks and challenges? What is the center of gravity or source of strength we want to protect? Then work out the destination. Where do we want to get to? Identify and articulate the desired set of circumstances, or you could call it vision, we aspire to. What objectives need to be achieved if that vision is to be unlocked? Think of them as doors into a room that need to be unlocked. What are the decisive conditions that need to be established to allow progress along a line of operation or a route to each objective? And then what actions and resources need to be applied to generate the outcomes if those decisive effects are to be achieved? Finally, recognize that circumstances are going to change. Constantly be asking how the external and indeed internal forces at work are changing, and therefore how the plan needs to adapt. As Eisenhower said, it's not the plan that matters, it's the planning. And it's the planning that allows you to adapt a plan when circumstances change. Now, that is a very simplistic overview. And of course, it's more complicated than I portrayed it. But put together, approaching strategy design like this allows you to build up that strategic pathway from which you make the detailed plans to achieve what you want to achieve, your desired set of circumstances. And thinking this way will help identify risks and the second and third order impacts of mitigating one risk on another, and also help you understand the relationship between risks. Let me give a very simple example. A mining company, and we've worked quite extensively with mining companies, planning its engineering operation, needs to think through the implications of this on the people amongst whom they operate, the community, the region, the province, and on the sustainability of its lines of operation. Now, that's easily said, but it's remarkable how many companies have got this wrong, sometimes catastrophically. I saw this firsthand with one of the first projects I did in the risk business with one of the largest global mining companies operating in Latin America. At that stage, and I went out some 10 years after they'd owned the mine, they'd spent over $4 billion, but they had not yet mined an ounce of gold or silver, and during which they had alienated local communities, the government, and just about every anti-mining NGO on the planet had them in its sight. And that was down fundamentally to a failure to think strategically, to think of it as a campaign, and to design a campaign plan and to manage interrelated risks at the very start of the project. So effective campaign planning also requires companies to have the philosophy and structures to be able to conduct integrated planning and execution with key stakeholders, people who are not necessarily at the company, potentially even opposition, at least to develop a degree of unity of understanding. There are two aspects to this. First, the establishment of the plugs and sockets to allow a company to reach out and work alongside those organizations reluctant to accept too close a corporate link. And there'll be many NGOs in this bracket. Second, the requirement for a multidisciplinary team at the heart of corporate strategic planning, capable of assessing the risks and threats to corporate activities and of working alongside governments, peoples, and other agencies to mitigate the risks to corporate activity, whether social, environmental, security, political, or otherwise. Such a team need not all be held on the company payroll. Indeed, in order to retain credibility with stakeholders, independence can be valuable, hence the value of third-party assurance. As for planning, that boxer Mike Tyson had it right when he said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And it was the Prussian General von Moltke who said that no plan survives contact with the enemy. So this means stress testing your plan, hence the value of business gaming, a decision-making tool based on the military technique of wargaming to test and evaluate plans, expose unidentified risks, and highlight potential opportunities. Business gaming provides a structured but intellectually liberating, safe-to-fail environment to help explore what works, winning, succeeding, and what does not work, losing, failing. It can either be relatively informal, a whiteboard session over a few hours, over half a day with key management, or a formal game with a red team role-playing key stakeholders, preferably including a company's most anarchic and free-thinking employees to really generate disruption, umpired by a third-party organization to plan, organize, and run the game. No military commander would normally launch an operation without wargaming the plan, assuming he or she has the time to determine the friction points or risks, and therefore the necessary contingency plans or mitigation strategies. Clearly, business leaders may not be facing an enemy in the same way that a military commander might. However, they will face friction, the law of unintended consequences, and Murphy's Law, which dictates that if anything can go wrong, it will, and at the worst possible time. Rigorous business gaming or scenario testing will minimize the risks of this happening. Underpinning everything is the information domain, for information is a strategic instrument in its own right, with influence being the desired product. And winning the battle of the narratives means telling the more compelling story, hence the importance of putting strategic communications at the heart of strategic planning and executing a sophisticated and well-planned influence operation to reassure stakeholders, deter and prevent potential risks, and protect company reputation. Well, to wrap things up, vision, strategic direction, innovation, and the ability to motivate and inspire while maintaining the drive, discipline, and relentless focus on the numbers will remain fundamental requirements of business leadership. However, commercial success requires more than purely commercial capabilities. Success today and in the future depends on the achievement of unity of purpose and effort with other non-commercial players in the business space. Leadership and corporate planning must adapt to meet the challenge of achieving truly integrated planning and execution with other stakeholders if risks are to be minimized, company operations secured, and the return on investment realized. As I said earlier, the military don't by any stretch of the imagination always get it right, but failure is a hard taskmaster, and the military is usually a learning organization, which in general learns from its mistakes, and business leaders could do worse than draw on the military's hard-won experience, and often as a result of not getting it right in managing risk. Thank you very much. I'm ready to take any questions or challenges you have for me.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. That was a wonderfully rich and wide-ranging talk, which has implications for virtually every kind of organization, not excluding Oxford colleges, I think. So I'm going to pick some questions. There are a couple of hands up already. Turn first of all to Oliver Johnson. So if you'll unmute yourself and state your question, please.
Hello, sir. Fellow history grad, so always nice to see the Mafia doing well. I actually, after history, I'm afraid I went the wrong way. I went to the Navy, not the Army, so you must forgive me that. But I've been a logistics commander of a mine hunting task group in Gulf, and I've been a risk manager in Navy Command HQ in Portsmouth. And certainly, from what I've seen in the Navy, the military is somewhat of a Jekyll and Hyde on the attributes you speak of. I think in operational matters, I completely agree with you. I think we are fantastic at risk management and planning and strategizing and all that kind of stuff, and mission command. I think in non-operational matters, when you think of us as a broader British institution, you know, managing a workforce, managing training, managing infrastructure, all that kind of stuff, I fear we're the precise opposite. We are terrible at managing risk because we are so risk averse. And I think a key part of managing risk has to be knowing when to take it. And we're terrified of doing that if someone's not shooting at us. So I suppose my question is twofold. Firstly, are there any lessons the military can learn from itself in its differing attitudes between its behaviour in operational affairs and its behaviour in what you may call domestic or institutional affairs? And the other is, are there any lessons businesses could learn from the military's shortcomings in this regard, in their differing approach to various areas of their business and business support and all that kind of stuff? And obviously those two questions hinge on the assumption that you agree with what I've said, and if you don't, then please do come back and tell me precisely what I'm wrong, and I'll very eagerly listen.
Well, thank you. And I know exactly what you mean, and I share your view. And in terms of operations, you're absolutely right. Generally speaking, and let's be clear, sometimes it doesn't get it right, and there are plenty of military history examples where it doesn't get it right. The Navy, the Army, the Air Force are locked to the hip in the delivery of really effective military capability. And you're absolutely right as well, and I speak as a former Chief of Staff of Land Command, that when it comes to infrastructure, budgets, maintenance of military housing, a recent headline in this week's Times about the Ajax tank, which can't operate at more than 20 miles an hour and apparently can't fire on the move, highlights the challenges in the procurement organization. So I think you're absolutely right. And the military those are clearly areas where things do not go right. I don't think there are any easy answers here. And you put your finger on one key point, which is the risk-averse nature, the horribly risk-averse nature. And the one factor I think which drives that is public financial accountability. And of course, that's not purely about the military. That brings in the civil service, it brings in the political level, it brings in the need to clear lines at a very high level politically very often. And I'm not going to say any more than that. Suffice it to say that when the military can get on with it, albeit with all the support needed from the political level and civil service, generally speaking, on operations, it gets it right. Although I would say, and I can say this from personal experience, where there is no strategy, arguably, and I'm going to chuck something out here for consideration, arguably, as we saw in our involvement in Iraq, however well we did tactically, the Sun Tzu quotation, I think, is more than reinforced. As to lessons the military, business can learn from where the military get it wrong, look and observe. I'd like to turn that round and say that I think there are a lot of lessons the military can learn from business, frankly, in running all the stuff that isn't absolutely necessarily at the sharp end. And I, in my resettlement, I spent 3 weeks at Manchester Business School doing a very, very neat little 3-week course, Wavetop, touching on some of the things that MBA students learn. And I wished I'd done that. I felt I came away, if I'd done that 20 years earlier, I'd have been much better as a senior staff officer and a senior commander, where some of the budgetary and other aspects came in. Because at the end of the day, if it's driven by a P&L and it doesn't work, you're not going to see, your businesses are not going to succeed.
Thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.
I'd like to turn now to Robert Ward.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Joan. Thanks for that very interesting talk there. I spent 30 odd years in the oil and gas business and did some consultancy afterwards, touching on some of the sort of things you're talking about. But my most recent retirement project is to be a councillor in the London Borough of Croydon, which somebody who I think knows described it as the biggest local authority failure since local authorities were invented in the 1830s. So and it's I'm an opposition councillor, so I can stand back a little, but I am on what's called scrutiny, so I have to take some responsibility for it. My observation is that the top of the organisation was in denial and fudged, and the rest of the organisation became extremely risk averse, and the costs basically ran out of control, and we would have gone broke had it not been for COVID. That brought it forward. Where we are at the moment is we have a new chief executive, but what I see is that the organisation is still not confronting the awful truth of the reality of the situation, and that is, part the top and middle. Well, I think the new chief executive is very well aware, and we're losing staff lower down because it's a very difficult situation to be in. I don't know where to start on getting strategic thinking there, because I think there's still that level of denial there. In the business you were in, you were getting shot at and risked people being killed. It's very indirect in our situation. Have you any thoughts on how one would, and particularly as I'm in opposition, it's rather more difficult, is to engage the upper level of the organisation to the need for strategic thinking, because my observation is it's not there. It's firefighting, still in the firefighting stage. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
That's a really interesting and challenging issue. That I mean, it does make me think of one experience we've had with one company, which was also operating in a mining company operating in Latin America, which was in denial in a sense about the state of affairs they were in, and they brought us in to look at what they were doing, and we put together a multidisciplinary team, and we went on a journey. Now we were supported by the chief operating officer, who'd been brought in as a sort of force for change, and needed a third party independent view of what was going on. So I think my first point would be that, if you can get a third party independent view who's prepared to look at an organization and be brutally honest about things, then you, I think, stand a chance of changing things. But of course, you've got to get that third party organization in the first place, and that depends. Is going to be. It strikes me as being pretty difficult if the leadership is in denial. It's a bit like I hesitate to use the analogy, but I'll say it anyway. You can only start. An alcoholic can only begin to resolve the challenge and go to AA if they recognise they've got a problem. But I think it very often organisations find it really hard to look at themselves, because they've got day-to-day stuff, they've got firefighting, they've got all the issues. They need somebody to be able to step back and provide an objective view of strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. And that might be the way to go. But you've got to get agreement from the leadership to do that. And of course, you're not going to get, that's not going to come for free. And they've got to be prepared to spend some money on that. But that might be the way to do it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, the money is an issue. I mean, there is something called a report in the public interest, which is public. So there is a document done by a consultancy which has kind of said these are all the things that you've got an issue with, and I think it's sort of accepted. But I think it's that next step of saying, well, okay, let's confront this in a strategic manner.
Well, that's where again, some support with from an organisation that can help think strategically and support by designing strategy. But I would say one thing here, and it's a sort of a phrase I've picked up in my sort of 6 years in business and consultancy. Which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. In other words, however sophisticated the strategy, and you can get people in to help, and that's the sort of thing we do. But however sophisticated and clever the strategy, unless you've got buy-in from the organization and that people in the heart and the engine room of the organization have been part of that design of strategy, implementation is not going to happen.
Thank you. Very, very helpful.
Howard Rosen.
Hello,
Howard. Richard. Hi, how are you? Lovely to see you.
It's great to see you.
You'll see that there are a number of the class of 74 on this call, and we're all very proud of you. And thank you very much for your presentation. So hello from sunny Zurich. Richard, I know that you've heard this many times before, but it's always said that the army fights the last war, not the next war. One of my favourite stories was always of the British, I think he was a general, but he might not have been, a commander who went into the Crimean War, into the Battle of Balaclava, shouting death to the French, only to be told afterwards that actually this time the French were the Allies. But he was a relic, of course, in the Napoleonic Wars. But there is some truth in that, isn't there? Now, I know that the military is trying very hard now to look forward, particularly looking at areas of cyber warfare. But how much is the military able to look forward rather than look back? And how much is it able to help us anticipate future risks that both the known unknown and the unknown unknown, if you like, the scenario planning, not just the contingency planning, and help by its own attitude, the business community also understand what things it has to anticipate in the future. And of course, nobody anticipated a pandemic 2 years ago, and we're all in the middle of it and struggling with it. So I'd be interested to know how you see that from your military background, and whether in fact the military is now refining techniques to actually understand what can happen in the future rather than looking at things backwards, looking at history.
Firstly, great to see you. Happy days when you were coxing the Exeter first eight in Torpids and Summer 8s. How long ago that is. But anyway, I'm going to look forward now, not back. It is, of course, it's an easy criticism to make of the military. But from what I would say, my experience is, and of course, it's something that we all do as human beings. We all look back and think, well, that's what happened last time. If something like that happens again, this is what we're going to do second time round. And of course, circumstances change. And the reality is that none of us can look into a crystal ball and see the future. However, I would say that the military spends an immense amount of time. And that's what it's there for. It's about thinking. If it's not on operations or fighting a current war, it's thinking about what might come around the corner. And it doesn't always get it right. But the key thing, as that great, to misquote the great Sir Michael Howard, former Regius Professor of Modern History in our great university, said, the key is to be not so far off the mark that it's not impossible to change when circumstances change, and you've realized, as Clausewitz said, just to drop that other name in, the first duty of a commander is to understand the nature of the war on which he is about to embark. So I think the military does it, tries to do it a lot, spends a lot of time and effort thinking about it. And I think a good example, frankly, is the recent Integrated Defence Review. By no means perfect, but that's quite a significant shift into recognizing the nature of the changing nature of war, the impact of what's commonly called the hybrid or the asymmetric, the importance of cyber, and you see that in the importance placed on bringing together cyber capabilities and a hugely broad range of capabilities, individual, personal, technical, etc., to meet the needs of what is likely to unfold in the future. Whether they got it right, only time will tell.
Simon Chadwick.
Hi, Richard. It's really great to see you again. And if I could just put on my camera, it would be great to be seen. I spent the majority of my career until I founded my own consulting company as CEO of 7 different companies in the marketing and media sector. And the majority of those, we were part of a larger group. So I was reporting into a CEO and board of directors, a larger group most of the time. Some of them were absolutely fantastic, brilliant strategists, hugely supportive, very much along the lines of that you were talking about in terms of trusting the people around them and giving them the initiative. A few were abysmal and were not strategists, but were pure tacticians. And in those circumstances, I found myself managing up about 70% of the time just to secure the future of my own company and those who worked there. And I wondered if the military, if in the military you've ever experienced or seen or heard of similar situations where perhaps the senior officers or senior command are not quite up to the job and those underneath them are kind of trying to mitigate the damage, and how the military deals with that. What sort of processes are in place? What sort of policies are in place that allows for that to be mitigated?
Well, it's a situation. Thank you, Simon. It's a situation that of course I recognise and which I've once had experience of. It's rare, but of course it does happen. And I think the first thing is that clearly if it becomes a serious impact on operational capability, or there's a disciplinary or other issue, then commanders do get removed. But I have to say, I think, and I'm going to sort of turn my criticism, I think the Americans are really good at this. They're really ruthless. And if commanders fail, they're moved. I'm afraid I don't think we're as good, actually. And I can think of plenty of incidences in recent years where, I'm going to be absolutely honest, where commanders have failed and have gone on to prosper. And there is that tendency that, oh, don't worry, old boy, let's promote out of it, which I'm afraid is a failing. What can you do about it? Well, in a sense, you've got to change the culture to really address that issue. And I touched on the same remarks earlier, where there was arguably a failure of strategy over the war in Iraq, the last war in Iraq. And although the tactics at the tactical level operated pretty successfully, so what can you do about it? Well, you can tell truth to power. You can say, and that's what reporting is about from the sharp end. And as a commander in Iraq, I was writing a weekly letter back, and I was, unstinting. I didn't spare where I felt there was things that needed to be sorted out. I said it, and you have to be prepared to take the consequences of that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Thank you. That's great and wonderful talk. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Great to see you.
Oliver Johnson.
Hello again, sir. I'll try not to monopolise all the time. I was really intrigued by a comment you made in response to one of the other questions. And I think you touched on it again then when you said culture eats strategy for breakfast. Because I find myself in violent agreement with you on that one. It almost goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think if you look at the risk aversion in non-operational fields, we get so used to being completely risk averse in dealing with public money that it becomes a culture, and we then implement that risk aversion in all of our other non-operational endeavours as well. And certainly when in the Navy, recently when I've seen the transformation programme be attempted, again, you've seen this very large blob of sort of middle-ranking officers and civil servants very, very resistant to anything that represents change. So the question really is, how do you deal with the culture problem? I'm reminded almost of Stolypin, who, when he implemented democracy reforms in Russia, said these reforms will take 20 years of peace to implement. And he didn't get 20 years of peace. He got 6 before there was a war, and lo and behold, the monarchy fell. Beyond just working patiently and consistently, how can you deal with the culture problem when it's resistant to innovation and change and risk management as necessary?
I think we may have temporarily lost our speaker.
It's okay. This happened once when I was on with an admiral, so I share his pain.
We'll give him a moment to come back in. Perhaps we could fill in this time. Oliver, you... Oops, excuse me. Hello? Okay. Good. Great. Thank you. We're waiting. Yeah. Okay. That was word from the front. Our speaker is coming back in.
Excellent.
But Oliver, you said earlier that are you in a business capacity now yourself as well, having left the Navy?
No, I'm in the Navy for now. I'm still technically in for now. I'm actually at the moment I'm the coordinator for the Royal Navy presentation team, or I think we're being renamed as part of transformation. We're now going to be domestic engagement. So going around and selling the Navy to the public, etc. But I've had an enjoyably wide variety of postings in the Navy. Absolutely no consistency whatsoever in the things I've been doing, which has been thoroughly enjoyable in its variety.
That sounds very appealing. Philip Ratcliffe, I'm intending to come to you next. Oh, here comes our speaker. So after Oliver, I'll turn to you.
Thank you very much.
You're back.
I do apologize. I don't know what happened there.
Well, we're very relieved to have you back.
Sorry about that. So I do apologize. I hadn't a clue what happened there. Oliver, you were saying.
Hello again, sir. Yes, I was just saying the comment you made in response to a couple of questions, culture eating strategy for breakfast. So I was just thinking, I find myself very much in agreement with you on that one. I think it almost feeds back into what we were talking about earlier, in that we become so risk averse in managing public finances that this risk aversion becomes a culture that then seeps into all of our business in our non-operational spheres. And certainly I've seen this recently in the Navy with regards to the transformation drive, in that you've got this large sort of blob of civil servants and middle ranking officers in HQ postings who are essentially have been in very long, and they're very used to the system, and they're very, very resistant to anything that represents change and innovation. I was kind of reminded almost of Stolypin when he implemented the democracy reforms in Russia, and he says these reforms will take 20 years of peace to bed in, which he didn't get. He got the First World War, and lo and behold, democracy didn't settle and the monarchy fell. So I suppose the question is, how do you deal with the culture question? Because most businesses can't afford to wait for 20 years of peace, in Stolypin's word, when you need to implement the risk management and the change and the innovation necessary to deal with the business you're facing. How do you fix the culture question? How do you tackle the culture question?
Some thoughts, and we haven't got that long, clearly. I mean, I think number one, it's about instilling a sense of purpose. What is the great and noble vision to which you're driving for? Look at what happened in 1982 when, at a moment's notice, the country had to put together a task force to sail to the Falklands. It was a noble purpose, and the country pulled together. The dockyards worked round the clock, and everybody just dropped everything and went for it. Difficult in the circumstances to describe, but there's got to be some unifying sense of purpose that go back to what Field Marshal Slim said was the first component of morale, the spiritual, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of a great and noble purpose, which motivates people and which they feel that they have a part in contributing to and to achieving. But I think it's also clearly it's about more than that. It's about inclusion. It's about creating that sense of a band of brothers and sisters, which again is straightforward on a ship or on a tank squadron or on a regiment. Much more difficult in the sort of organizations you're talking about. But I think also it's about speed and drive. And I can remember going back to my time in Land Command when we had actually at the time, McKinsey were advising about the transformation of bringing together a single army headquarters, and the message loud and clear was to push on with it, because if you don't push on with it, it gets stuck in that marzipan layer you're describing about. Yeah. People start hiding behind sofas and kicking ideas into tubs. So it's got to be leadership, purpose, and get on with it.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you. I will vacate space for someone who's not asked you two questions already.
Oh, Rick, I think your microphone is on.
Sorry, Philip Ratcliffe, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sir Richard, thank you for your talk. I speak as somebody who had a career in industry as an internal auditor. And one of my roles as an internal auditor was as secretary of the Group Risk Committee. And we would diligently meet on a regular basis and discuss things fairly earnestly. But I rather felt at the end of the meeting, the members of the committee felt that the box had been ticked and off they went on their way. How do you get people to take risk seriously when, by definition, risk is something which hasn't yet happened? Mm-hmm. And management still have to deal with a lot of stuff which has happened. Mm-hmm. And the particular instance, very important one, I think I would raise with you, where this is clearly the case, is the pandemic risk. I mean, it was the top of the government's risk register for many years. And when the risk actually crystallized, the government was running around like a headless chicken. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
It's about leadership, about appetite for risk, and we've worked with many different companies where, in many cases, there's a really healthy appetite to risk, and a CEO who says, "Look, I want to have a look at this. I think we're okay, but I'm not sure, and I'd like you to look at it from an independent perspective and let us know. We've sat down with the risk register, which might be quite well maintained, normally by somebody quite, relatively junior. He or she's not on the board, and all too often, what happens is the board take it, but it might be last on the agenda, and there might be lunch beckoning or something. I'm being flippant, but you know what I mean. What we found as well is if you can analyze that, look at it, we could look at that, and then we'll sit down with the leadership and say, okay, put the risk register to one side. Let's hear what's really worrying you. And we go through, we've got a framework of risk. What's really keeping you awake at night about the commercial side, the social side, the security, the regulatory, the legal, the political, et cetera, and very often there's a real mismatch between the two. I think there's a change. I think there's a change of culture in the last year and a half or so, because there's been so much flung at companies and organizations and us all, the world, the countries, as a result of the pandemic, that people, I think there's a recognition now of that risk is, the sort of the language we've been talking about risk is increasingly, we're finding that in other places. I mean, you highlight the government point there, the pandemic. It's got to be a learning organization, and if it's not a learning organization, it's not going to learn the lessons. It's not going to stress test or business or war game or business game, or implement the lessons learned as a consequence of the issues that the pandemic raised. But I think it's down to individual leadership, and again we come back to the culture question.
Thank you very much.
I have a final question from Jerry Herbert, please.
Hi, Jerry.
Jerry, please go ahead.
Rector, thank you. And General Richard, lovely to see you again. And for the benefit of others, General Richard and I shared some time both at Exeter and in the Army. And I've had 10 years in industry since leaving the Army. Delighted to hear you just now talking about leadership. And can I sort of try and round this off by asking you questions on styles of leadership and leadership qualities? Now that you're seeing things outside the military, what are your views on whether or not there are different styles needed and different qualities to lead on the battlefield and in the boardroom?
Great question to finish with. Well, fundamentally, the leadership is the same whether it's on the battlefield and the boardroom. It's about inspiring people to do willingly and well what they might not necessarily want to do. And a pretty sound definition of a leader is somebody whom people want to follow. And he or she could be the CEO of a major mining company, or running a media operation, or indeed running a gunner regiment or a ship. I think leadership also has to take account of changing circumstances, and the leadership that I certainly remember, and you probably remember, being exercised in the military world when I was a young officer, I just don't think would stack up, because the world has changed fundamentally. It's a much more inclusive, it's a much more open, it's a much more aware world that's aware of challenge, of weakness, of recognizing that you've got to nurture and support in a way which perhaps didn't happen before. And I suspect the same probably applies in business. I think the one difference, though, the one thing that business could absolutely learn from the military is the time and effort invested in training leaders. And what one sees again and again is that, I mean, somebody might be very successful in the business world, but he or she may not have had the same sort of time and effort invested in leadership that a comparable military officer would have. As you know, and I know, no young man or woman crosses the gates at Sandhurst, and the same would apply to Dartmouth or Cranwell, without having had a deep and rigorous assessment of leadership potential. And thereafter, leadership is built into every aspect of training and development, really all the way through life education. And then on top of that, it's based on a system of core values, and the organization invests time and effort and real capitation rates in senior people spending a lot of time assessing reports, working boards, selecting people for the right leadership roles. So there, in terms of characteristics, I would say leadership is an intensely individual thing. Everybody does it differently because we're all different. And it depends on the organization you're running. But there's one certain area that the business world could learn from the military, I think, which is to invest time in leadership training.
Well, I would like to close this evening, this webinar, with thanks to everyone who's attended, not least to those who have posed questions. To my colleague, Amelia Cross, who holds their webinar series together, and not least this one. But of course, especially, Richard, to you for what I think has been a very remarkable talk, including your responses to questions. Using the military as your jumping off point, you've adopted what we social scientists or would-be social scientists like to call the case study method. But I think this has been a wonderful case study in itself of using a jumping off point and extending it in a way which has demonstrated relevance to the whole range of organizations that you alluded to at the beginning. You were remarkably concise in your presentation, and you've been very incisive and crisp along the way. I'm sure I'm very far from alone in your audience in having taken a great deal from this talk. It's been incredibly rich, and we're very grateful to you indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me, and it's been a pleasure to be back with the Exeter community and to see so many old faces, old friends and faces.
Well, we'd like to claim credit for the wonderful qualities of this talk, the fruits of an Exeter education, a few other things too, I expect, but we'll claim as much of the credit as we can get away with.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and